Hi, I'm Susan. I'm from Well Peaceful, and I've been contemplating the subject of ethics. It's come up very strongly for me, particularly today. I feel very inspired to discuss this. There's lots of ways of looking at ethics, but I thought before I'm going to read you some poetry because that's how I access my ethics is through poetry, the creative, what's innate within me. But before I express the poetry that I felt inspired to write, let's have a look at what analytically we think is ethics. So I just did a little Google search. Ethics, the noun, moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. Medical ethics also enter into the question. Synonyms, moral code, morals, morality, moral stand, moral principles, moral values, rights and wrongs, principles, ideals, creed, credos, ethos, rules of conduct, standards of behaviour, virtues, dictates of conscience, the ethics of journalism. Really interesting. So first up, you can see morality is very much in there in principles. Things that we determine as right or wrong is the analytical approach, which has come from the Greeks, Aristotle and Plato, questioning what is morality. So another part says the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles. So I'm just going to go down a little bit, and this has come from the Ethics Centre. What is ethics? Ethical beliefs shape the way we live, what we do, what we make, and the world we create through our choices. BBC Ethics, Introduction to Ethics. At its simplest, ethics is a system of moral principles. They affect how people make decisions and lead their lives. Ethics is concerned with what is good for individuals and society, and is also described as a moral philosophy. So it's come from the philosophers, but also religion as well. As people try to determine what is right or wrong, we get reward and punishment within that. So if someone exhibits unethical behaviour, they become diminished in the eyes of others. So there's a suggestion there that ethics accords value to someone. So do we value an ethical person over an unethical person? And there's deeper questions within that is, can we value all people no matter what they do? I'm a peace educator, so for me, I'm always looking at valuing others. Even if I perceive them to be unethical, I value them as human beings, and I still don't feel the desire to hurt them as a result of, let's say, they hurt me. There's a very strong sense of inner integrity, which disciplines me from hitting back, because I don't actually want them to feel the pain that I've felt. I want somehow for them to be inspired to an expanded vision of themselves. Perhaps there's a way to access what's innate within them so that something awakens within them, and that then leads them to not engage in behaviours or attitudes that are unethical. So I suppose what runs me is more of an educational theme. I want to see that people learn. But then what do you do with someone who's pathological or a narcissist, where there's a kind of a wiring within them where they actually aren't able to feel the empathy, or perhaps they're not able to see the world as you see the world? Does that then mean that we find ways to control their behaviour? And of course, laws and what have you have come out of this idea of social control to control behaviour, as distinct from, a self-governing paradigm where we are fully responsible for our actions. Should we be punished if we don't do what society believes we should. How do we know society's right? How do we know what's right and wrong? So I suppose what I would come down to is, how do you feel? And some people would say, well, some people feel good doing awful things to people. At a deeper level, I would assert that they don't. They might be able to justify it and soothe it, because when you're in denial or in a lie, you can find ways to make it okay with yourself to continue on with the behaviour. But deep within you, you would feel guilt, and guilt would be the sign that you're not acting in accordance with your true spirit, your true values. So that's just a little bit of an intro. I will go straight to my poetry because it creates a contrast. I've had no training in ethics or values, so the work that I write really just comes up from within me. It's my inner knowledge, if you like, guiding me on subjects of ethics and honesty and so forth. So let me read this out to you, and you can decide what you think about it or feel about it. It's called, What is the True Value of Virtue? What is integrity without honesty? What is honesty without ethics? What are ethics without values? For integrity, honesty, and ethics is the meaning that defines your life. It has nothing to do with plagiarism, as all life is copied and replicated. It is not an algorithm of stepwise procedures, for life is not a linear equation calculated. It is the rhythm of a singer with virtuous tone that forms the foundation stone, a standing stone encircling the precision of the equinoxes, reminding us that the winter solstice completes the circle every 26,000 years. And as the left and the right hemispheres are opposite, marking new beginnings and departures, as the sublime becomes the ridiculous, social harmony sings the one song. It is the highest keynote without speech. It only sings to touch all hearts and minds, making sure no one is out of reach. For this is the one song where all reach for their highest peak in perfect pitch. For lies tear us apart in a rift valley. As my heart has been crying a long time, mourning integrity, honesty, and ethics with no insight. As a prism becomes a prison with no light. Conflict and abuse are opposites. One is misunderstanding, the other is the misuse of power. One seeks resolution, the other looks for outcomes that pay off, the highest self-interest. As I stare into my space, I wonder at the solar system. I ponder space and time. Einstein's relativity in search of the absolute. For who can be resolute in righteousness? Who can be absolute in incompleteness? When you cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. The middle ground is the space between conflict parties, to risk all in no man's land. For no one wins when both lose the meaning. When valour becomes winning at all costs. When courage ignores all cries for help. When truth is in denial. For this is not a river in Egypt, nor can artifacts be hidden in the king's chamber. For Tutankhamun restored the god's image, resurrecting diplomacy over aggression, as harmony was perceived as a strength, not a weakness to exploit. As I look into the mirror of reflection, I toss a pebble and watch the ripples radiate. I wonder, can love spin and get nowhere? I stare into a distant future that has no horizon. for it is beyond my line of sight. It is a world beyond what is wrong or right. It is a place of great clarity and charity. It is a home that has a heart. Why do we put the cart before the horse? Why race horses in unequal courses? When kindness can be the first thought, not the last. For that is to win-win before the start. As I look into the past, I can feel no peace in sounds of silence. Perhaps this is the zen of one hand clapping, as the power of silence is deafening indifference. Indifference is a quarantined difference, corralling diversity as a wild card. Yet purpose is the labyrinth seeking the epicenter in meditations on true meaning. As a puzzle resolved using a turnkey refit, as completion completes the cycle of abuse with the final question, is it better to be right or happy? The answer will define the future of children. Will they learn to see the world anew? See, I see ethics as really being governed by beliefs. It's a kind of a shared beliefs that everyone agrees upon as codes of conduct. We have mission statements in companies. These days, most people are learning, this type of ethical behaviour through the corporate sphere. Yet what I'm really talking about in here is looking at virtues that really produce social harmony. It's not kind of a scaffolding which creates that structure of ethical conduct that we're mindful of, rather than heartful. What I'm seeing is a heart-based intelligence versus the intellectual pondering that we saw in Greek agoras, that's unfurled through philosophers who are thinking, therefore they are. So therefore the value is accorded based on to think, therefore I am. Whereas I've often been inspired to say, to feel, therefore I'm not. And what that means in my philosophy has been selflessness. The ego just diminishes. The more I act from this deep sense of who I am, and in a sense, I suppose you could say to do unto others as you would have do unto you. It doesn't feel good when someone's unethical. You can't trust them. But it's really going deeper into being able to access that conscience within yourself without formal steps. As I said in the beginning of the poem, I talked about stepwise, a stepwise approach, which is really a logical approach to ethics, really, as distinct from doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel right, this is not who I am. I'll give you some examples, actually. I remember a very, I won't stipulate the name of the organisation, just as an ethical approach toward them. But a very big scientific organisation offered me work to commercialise scientific technology. I'm a market analyst by training. Now, had I taken this position, it would have been a huge step forward in my career as a market analyst as well. I would have had a considerable reputation that would have come from this because of the high reputation of this organisation as a leader in science. I had at the time $20 in my bank account. My inner feeling was to ask questions, which I did, and it turned out that the commercialising of the scientific technology was to do with genetic modification, GMOs. So I had to sit back and reflect on this. Do I want to participate in an activity that I feel may undermine support systems on the planet. Now, genetic modification is not just rearranging the deck chairs. It's not about widgets. It's not an engineering thing in the sense of restructuring something that's a physical object of a human design, okay? Now, I can hear people saying, yes, it is. It's a genome and you're rearranging the DNA. Because the DNA is fundamental to the blueprint of not only human life, but all life on Earth, that's had 4 billion years of natural selection to shape the genetic heritage, if you like. The beauty of nature is that it is sensitive enough environmentally to favour various genes. For those that survive will be the ones that are in harmony with that environmental schema, is probably the way I'd put it, in harmony with the environment. So natural selection basically kills off anything that's not in harmony with the larger blueprint. It's very much got the whole in mind. The genetics has been coded in such a way that only those genes that favour the environment around it will be naturally selected. Those that are not in harmony actually die off. It's very interesting. So I had some very important choices to make. Would I lend my energy to something like this that could promote my career? This would have definitely promoted my career for sure. It would have taken me down a trajectory where I probably would have been out public speaking far more. I would have been earning a lot of money. But ethically, I couldn't do it. Because what was more important to me was being in integrity with who I am. And I'm, by nature, a peaceful person. By nature, I care very much what happens to others and what happens to nature. So I asked questions of one of the business managers whom, had been very interested in me. And I asked him if he could guarantee me that this genetic modification wouldn't adversely affect nature. And of course he couldn't. Because what we're talking about here is genetic modification of plants in order to produce, resistant forms of plants, to various insects, so that they would produce more, so that they could then, cultivate more plants, they could make more money. And this is where the money side of things becomes a distortion to what is natural within us. We allow the money to dictate our ethical decisions. We say, oh, well, what if I do it for 6 months? I might rationalise, just do it for 6 months, get a name and then move on. See, my inner feeling in terms of ethics is that I would actually be lending my energy to something, and that does matter. Can I live with myself? And the answer was no. Even though my partner at the time was encouraging me, he couldn't understand why I would decline such a great offer. But I did. So for me, ethics has been very important. I'll also convey another case where I was challenged with ethics. I was working as an independent researcher, and a club asked me to do research into gambling. I had done research for them before, but it wasn't along the lines of specifically interrogating data to find out the behaviour and attitudes of high rollers. I was typically doing demographic, who actually gambles was the first study. So that was okay. That was simply just knowing about that. So I felt okay with that. The second study was really to look into the motivations of high rollers. So they actually wanted to use the research in order to encourage a negative behaviour of gambling. And again, I didn't have much money at the time, but I chose not to do it. And again, people around me were surprised, But I don't regret anything. I don't regret any decisions I've made in the past. I've always done them for the highest reasons. For me, money is not important. Ethics and values are important. because they define who you are. You have to live with who you are, ultimately. And if you can't look yourself in the mirror and be okay with that, well, then you're going to be dodging. Not only that, when you drop your ethical standards, you then allow others to, or you think, well, I've done it, so it can't be that bad. But if we keep to high ethical and what I call values-based standards, I'm not really a subscriber of the morality. I see that as more defined coming from either religious or philosophical bases. I tend to come from my own inner feeling of conscience. What would happen if everybody did this might be a question I might ask myself. Obviously, if it's a detrimental or a negative behaviour, if everybody did it, well, it's not going to serve the whole of humanity, is it? So then I would have to say no to something like that. But ultimately, it comes down to what makes you feel good. And that's where your very basis and foundation for happiness arises out of. So I just thought I would share a little bit of my own ethical and values-based framework. It's not even really a framework. It's really real hope is the framework, which I've talked about in quite a few videos. That's responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and service. That's real hopes, it's a model. And I'll just say very briefly before I finish, the real part of the model is if you want to look at something through authenticity, is it real? Then it will reflect responsibility, the ability to respond. You can do something. It will reflect empathy, in that I'm standing in the other's shoes. In my case, with my ethical thing, it was to do with nature. What would happen to nature? Awareness, what do I know? What are the facts? What do I notice? What am I aware of in terms of my own identity? Who am I? Am I beyond this persona, this person called Susan? And then, of course, love. If I imbue my decision-making with a sense of love for nature, a love for people, a love for myself, how then will I make my decisions? So that's being real, that's being authentic. So that's part of the real hopes. The hopes part is honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and service. Am I being honest about making this decision? I would have been dishonest to myself had I gone into the GMO commercialisation, because that's not in alignment with who I am. I'm a believer in harmony, in oneness. I believe that I am responsible for what impacts other people. I believe that my energy does matter where I direct it. It really matters as to who I become. And because I've got spiritual aspect to myself, I see that as having implications for where I go. I can see a decision tree. If I take this road or that road or this road, it actually leads me somewhere. And I really believe that every single decision matters. And if you're making it in integrity, you're going to wind up somewhere where you feel very good about who you become. So that was awareness. So we've got real hopes, honesty, oneness. I'm one with the planet. All my thoughts actually connect with the whole. They call it electromagnetic energy. All thought creates. They say that fate is from all thoughts everywhere. That's the acronym for fate. It's interesting, isn't it? So if we're all thinking coming from inner conscience, we're going to create a completely different world. If we're all coming from self-interest that's removed from any form of ethics or values, well, then you'll see a world that's values-free. There's no values, so no one will care how you're impacted by a decision. So that's the oneness, is that idea that we're all interconnected. Nature, of course, is very easy to see that it's all interconnected. So if we genetically modified something, it's going to have kick-on effects with other insects, with other aspects of nature, the soils. If it's a monoculture, obviously we're not going to have that multifaceted ecosystem which houses a range of life forms, which has implications given the type of environmental zone that it's in. There's so many expanded, and this is awareness. I'm actually expanding my awareness as I'm going through real hopes. So I'm not just going at it in a singular way of self-interest. I'm going to make money. I'm exploring the implications of such a decision and how it links back to who I am as the creator of my reality. So that was oneness, peace. So we're talking hopes here. This is giving hope. Hopes. So peace is balance, the yin and the yang. On balance, what would GMOs do? Well, it could have a massive impact on the environment, particularly if that genetic material can spread and be taken up by other organisms. Other organisms can get wiped out because that balance that was inherent from 4 billion years of nurturing, it could completely cause all sorts of problems. And if you've got particular species that are part of that tipping point, very important keystone species, these are the ones that if they die out, it has a massive knock-on effect. That would concern me. So my own life could be affected ultimately, or the generations ahead of me could be affected. And if I'm conscious, if I feel a responsibility for the future, well, then I'm going to think very deeply about whether my energy is going to benefit humankind or it's just going to simply benefit my self-interest as I make some money out of it. So peace is also inner peace. How do I feel? Do I feel peaceful about this decision? Does it sit well with me? Or do I feel something nagging at me that's saying, this is not right? This is not who I am. And of course, enjoyment is the joy that I get from making that decision. It feels really good. I feel really happy. When I develop peace, nonviolence, and anti-bullying education, I feel very excited. It makes me really happy because I know that I'm helping children. I'm bringing peace and nonviolence into their lives, and that's a very joyful thing for me. I teach it as a clown, so it's even double the enjoyment. And of course, service was the last one in hopes. When I integrate all my values, I feel I'm of service to the whole of humanity. So that really is what really connects me to the whole. So I make sure that all my actions, my decisions will benefit the whole. It's not just about benefiting myself. So that just gives you a bit of a feel for, this is a values-based model that I created. It's not a framework. Actually, framework's got a structure. It's got a scaffolding around it, which doesn't really access the inner, innate stuff. And I really feel that well-being springs from innate values rather than a shared ethical framework that everyone's agreed upon in terms of ensuring that the reputation is protected or we minimize risks as a result of that. That's a very corporate, commercial lens through which people are seeing. I think the values-based prism, which is a different word, I think that sits better. Anyway, that is my contribution to ethics. May it serve you. May it serve humanity. May we all serve humanity. So with that, I will say goodbye and thank you very much for listening to me. And I very much enjoyed sharing my poetry. Take care of yourself. Be happy.